So we are the most vulnerable country in the International Energy Agency, which is the 27 countries, industrial countries, which was set up as an alternative to OPEC. The International Energy Agency requires all of its members to keep a 90-day supply, strategic petroleum reserve, but they make an exception if you are a net exporter, because sensibly they assume that you are going to supply your own citizens before you do any exports. So obviously you do not need a strategic petroleum reserve. The only problem is that Canada doesn't do this. We act as if we are an importing country, but we don't have a strategic petroleum reserve. Norway, which is one of the a net exporting country, one of the few industrial ones, it supplies its own citizens first, but it also requires that oil companies keep an emergency reserve. So Canada, why does Canada act so imprudently then and not protect its own citizens? Well, it's because we have government leaders who either misrepresent or misperceive Canada's energy role. As we know, Prime Minister Stephen Harper frequently brags that Canada is an emerging energy superpower. He certainly hasn't consulted a dictionary. Superpowers influence events by projecting military, economic, political, and cultural power on a world scale. Is that Canada? Harper's inflated language hardly fits Canada's role, which is more like an energy colony. Colony or satellite is a people who lose control of their resources to a foreign power. That's really the definition of what a colony is. When you cannot safeguard your citizens from freezing in the dark, nor control how much you export, nor set the price at which citizens buy back their own oil from foreign transnational corporations, you know that you're not a superpower. Instead, as the U.S. the number one supplier of oil to the U.S., Canada helps to ensure American energy security. Canada is prohibited from using its oil to supply half of its citizens during international shortages. No other country is forbidden from using domestic resources to provide for its own citizens. Instead, Canada must export at the moment 2/3 of our oil production to the U.S., and then depend on this imported oil. And so we actually have a lot of oil. On the natural gas side, we don't. We only have 9.3 years of proven supply of natural gas. Yet rather than stretch out the dwindling stocks for Canadians by cutting exports, Canada must also send more than half, about 60%, to the U.S., which is the current proportion. So why has Canada got to do this? It's because of proportionality. And I think we've got to make Canadians more aware of this proportionality clause, because it was the great prize that the Americans won in NAFTA and the Free Trade Agreement and then NAFTA, and it is the thing which really holds us back from having sovereignty and from having a good environmental policy. Richard Heinberg, who's a California energy writer on energy, he wrote about proportionality in February. He said, it's unique in all of the world's treaties. Canada has every reason to repudiate the proportionality clause and to do so unilaterally and immediately. Well, what does this proportionality clause say? It requires Canada and Canada alone to maintain its share of energy exports to the United States. This was, as I say, the big prize for the U.S. negotiators of the Free Trade Agreement, and proportionality, when we went into NAFTA, got folded into NAFTA. And the reason why they wanted to do it was they wanted to prohibit Canada from reducing oil exports to the United States, as we did in 1975, in response to threats of energy shortages in eastern Canada. And then it went into NAFTA. Mexico, when came into NAFTA, they said, no, we're not doing this. It's a major exporter of oil and a NAFTA member, but they rejected it, and it's not, on the grounds that they would lose their energy sovereignty. And this is just a Canadian clause. I mean, it's written as if it applies to everybody, you know, with this Mexican exemption. The U.S. hardly exports any energy. You know, basically this is a Canadian clause. Besides preventing Canada from guaranteeing oil to its own citizens, proportionality severely hinders Canada from making deep cuts to greenhouse gas emissions. So there is a very strong tie between energy security, energy sovereignty, and the environment. A substantial drop in Canadian consumption of oil and gas would not lead to a commensurate fall in their production. What proportionality does is it breaks the umbilical cord between Canadian consumption and Canadian production. So if Canadians lowered the consumption of fossil fuels, the surplus would just be exported to the United States, and we would be locked into then exporting a higher share of these fossil fuels in the United States. Now, when you look at the figures, the single greatest increase in greenhouse gases is coming from the production of energy in Canada, from production of oil, rather than from its consumption. I mean, there are both, but the biggest single source is the tar sands. As we know, conventional oil is going down. The tar sands production is going up, and the greenhouse gas intensity is almost 3 times as great for tar sands oil. So if we cut consumption substantially, which we must do, it would not affect the production of tar sands oil. And as we know, most of that is earmarked for the U.S. And it was part of the SPP negotiations is that these should go up by a factor of 4 or 5 times. The tar sands are such a big emitter of greenhouse gases because it takes so much of Canada's diminishing supply of natural gas to heat up the tar sands and provide hydrogen. I'm going to quote Jim Dinning here even favorably here in his hometown of Calgary. He said that injecting natural gas into the oil sands is like, to produce oil is like turning gold into lead. He was Alberta's treasurer. It's going to be hard to convince Canadians then to substantially cut fossil fuel usage, buy smart cars or cycle, so that more Americans can drive SUVs and Hummers. Meanwhile, Canada will still be labeled the climate bad boy, climate change bad boy, and we would be. This is the perversity of the proportionality clause. If the U.S. cuts energy consumption, it boosts their energy independence. If Canadians cut energy consumption, we just export more to the U.S.